This panel will continue to explore the central theme of data processing. And this time, we'll be talking about its use and applications, particularly the potentials in managing security at the borders. Now, there has been a growing body of literature in this subject matter. And of course, this includes the research work that has been undertaken by the WCO. Our first presentation this afternoon would be the outcome of a rigorous research looking at the distribution of data of political violence over space and time in some locations in North and West Africa. This will cover the Maghreb, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad region. As customs officers, we will be very interested in what we can make of the data that has been collected over a period of time and over the distance that we have talked about. So first, I present a distinguished scholar and a researcher, a professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada, a fellow of Flinders University with cross-appointment as a fellow at Queen's University. In his research work and teachings, he has demonstrated expertise in security and defense studies, in political demography, among others. Please join me with a warm applause. In the next 30 minutes, thereabouts, we shall be having Professor Christian Leuprecht. Prof.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Hello, ladies and gents. I will present in English, but if you wish to ask your questions in French, please feel free. Thank you.
Sort of concern that I have about how can we help reinforce many of the efforts within the region. And I think there's two dimensions to this. I have a separate life in political demography, and those of you who study demography within this region will know that there's considerable demographic growth that is going to happen over the coming decades, and that there are considerable asymmetries in terms of the economic, political, and social structures relative to the demographic growth. And so one of the challenges is how do we make sure that the region becomes a livable, flourishing space for all these additional people who are going to be joining. And I think one of that is making sure that we can make the flow of people and the flow of trade and commerce work as well as we possibly can. So I'll present two papers today that what I will not talk about is how exactly we do this. So the method, so the magic sort of behind this, you can get out of the papers, or I'm happy to talk to you in person. What I'm trying to get you to wrap your head around is what is it that we can actually do with the sort of data that we have in an interesting and creative way to help us tell something about borders, about violence, about the costs involved in crossing borders that can advance the overall objectives that we all have from the perspective of people who are concerned about borders. I'll need the deck up here. Thank you. So the first paper takes a more conventional approach to social network analysis. The second one turns it upside down in the sense that the second one is trying to get to a predictive model as to how violence diffuses and the role that borders play in that, and how and whether and where you may want to reinforce borders to that particular effect. So we're familiar with the challenges in the region, so weak and failing states that are challenged by non-state actors, some of which are more powerful and better resourced than some of the states within the region, and in West Africa, the upsurge in political and religious violence. There's the challenge of shifting loyalties within these groups, and groups that are highly mobile. So think of this much more as sort of naval type of warfare rather than land warfare. That's very much about controlling people rather than about controlling territory. And you can see here from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs just how quickly the region has deteriorated in terms of the security circumstances. So that's simply to make the point of just how pressing, I think, more creative thinking about the region is. So two basic questions here is how these actors, both the violent actors and the state-based actors, connected structurally. Does their positional role within a network play a difference with regards to the violence that emanates from them? And then what role do state borders play in spatial patterns with regards to some of these violent extremist groups? And so here we'll use a method that's called spectral embedding. We won't get tied up in what exactly that is, but basically you can think of it as two types of structures. One is the relationships that individuals have, and the other is the direction of those relationships. So if I attack you, then we have a direction in terms of that particular attack. If we're simply friends, then there's not necessarily a direction to that, but there's a structure to that by virtue of the fact that we are friends. So the broader context here is, of course, that we have a lot more geospatial, geo-referenced, and statistical data available to us. The advances in spatial statistical analysis, the proliferation of political and economic predictors, as we also saw in the previous presentation. And so the broader questions about the onset and diffusion of violence. So understanding this simply, for instance, as attributes of a particular group or as sort of exogenous influences. Let's understand political violence as a relational process between individuals, but in particular between groups and between actors within the region. And then these relationships are embedded in alliances. I won't talk in great detail about the ACLET database because Thomas will do so, I understand, in a separate presentation. It's been around for 20 years and gives us very robust data on the Northwest African region. So one of the challenges when we talk about violence in Northwest Africa is that if, as a prof, you want to do research on some of these violent groups, it's a little bit difficult to go and join them and travel around with them because that might be hazardous to my health. So how then can we measure these groups? And so what ACLET allows us to do, instead of measuring relationships between people, as we commonly do in social network analysis, we can measure relationships between events, because what ACLET codes are different types of violent events. Shootouts, bombings, kidnappings, these sorts of things that we're familiar with sort of from the media. And so this is not a representation of the actual groups, rather than what you're going to see is basically a proxy representation of the effects that those groups have for us to draw the networks around them. When we talk about groups, this is not, of course, one coherent group, because groups have a habit of morphing, of changing alliances, of changing leaders. And so here we're treating 9 groups as sort of quasi-Al-Qaeda affiliated. And so it is a simplification, but you'll see that the simplification works and works quite well nonetheless. But this is to say that I understand that this is a highly nuanced issue. We can also see that the geography of violence, this is not a random distribution, that there are 5 regions where you have particularly intense violence. So you can see the Nigerian region here at the bottom. You see northern Algeria, you see northern Libya. You'll see the border between Chad and Sudan. This is the Darfur conflict. And then you see sort of the Gulf of Guinea, and this is sort of remnants of the civil wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and whatnot. Now, this is important because it means that people aren't randomly going around and killing people or blowing things up. That there's some rationality behind the violence that people are committing. And so then the question is, can we extract some of that rationality in terms of understanding how these actors behave? You can also see that violence and deaths related to ideological and religious extremist groups are now the bulk of the fatalities that we see. So we all know this is a pressing problem, but just kind of to reinforce that. So one of the questions we want to ask is who is in conflict with whom? And so there's a basic premise of what's known as transitivity. So the friend of my, if I'm friends with you and I'm friends with someone else, those two individuals are likely to be friends. But if I'm an enemy of you and I'm an enemy of someone else, it doesn't necessarily follow that the other two individuals are enemies. And so whether you have positive or negative ties has an important implication for the way we think about these networks. So this is what is known as a negative tie network. By negative ties, I mean people who are in conflict with one another. And so you see the organizations that you're all familiar with, but what comes out here are three key clusters, and this is what we would also expect to see. So there's the Nigeria cluster around Boko Haram, there's the Trans-Sahel cluster around Al-Qaeda, and there's sort of the Libyan cluster sort of off on the right hand of the side. You can see how relatively unconnected the Libyan cluster and the AQIM cluster are. You can also see how central AQIM is to this particular network. And you can see how relatively well connected AQIM is to other actors who are in conflict with one another. And so strategically, this is what you want, because you want other actors who are fighting each other, then they're not as busy fighting you. The other thing to notice about Boko Haram is that the actors that Boko Haram are in conflict with are not connected to each other. So you'll see that this has implications for how we think about the network. So now we just hope that this goes on. Can we click through to the next? It won't click through here on the. There we go. Very good. It still won't click, unfortunately. You might just need to click it manually for me. There we go. We'll keep trying. All right, so you can see that we can calculate the position that each group has within that network. And so you can see that there are relatively few non-state actors who are central to this network, and that the negative relationships among these actors affect the outcome in terms of violence. You can also see that AQIM has the most enemies, and that it is the most connected to other actors that themselves have a lot of enemies. So in social network analysis, degree centrality is about how connected you are. Eigenvector centrality is about how connected you are to other entities that have lots of other connections. And so you can see that on both those counts, AQIM plays an important role. So this is the positive tie network. So if we take this and we look at all the entities that are positively, that are friends with one another, you can see again that there's three clusters that emerge. These are the clusters that we would expect to emerge. You can see sort of at the top, the Libyan quasi-cluster, and off at the right-hand side, and you can see how these clusters are unconnected. You can see Boko Haram sort of in the bottom center, and notice how Boko Haram is not connected to any of the other actors. And then you can see sort of the military forces throughout sort of North and some of West Africa off on the left-hand side. Now notice in particular the two red dots that are off on the top left-hand sort of corner, and these are the police and military of Cameroon. One of the interesting observations is that, for instance, the military of Nigeria, so the security forces in Nigeria and the security forces in Cameroon are not actually connected to one another. This is an issue I'll get back to, that connectivity is something that is lacking in terms of overcoming some of the collective action problems in the region. You can see for a positive tie network, this is not your usual type of positive tie network. You have very long path lengths between the different nodes. It's a very low density network. Usually people who are friends have a much greater density in the network, and they have a low clustering coefficient. What does this tell us? That what we see here are not alliances, but rather ad hoc opportunities for people to collaborate with one another. Notice also on the bottom left-hand corner, the one entity that seems to be connected to everyone else sort of in North and West Africa are the French military forces. In red, the red dots are military forces, the green dots are sort of violent extremist groups, the yellow dots are police forces, and the blue dots are other types of actors. And so you can see that the militaries are the sole sort of actors that are genuinely sort of connected throughout the region. If you then do the same sort of calculation that we just did for the negative tie network, for the positive tie network, you can see the isolation of Boko Haram, and you can see the Libyan groups and the Sahel sort of groups, and you can see here, so we can calculate the centrality of the French armed forces, and we can also calculate the centrality of Nigeria when it comes to the broader connectivity within the region. Here we apply spectral embedding techniques with regards to the violence. So on the picture on the left, so figure 3, you see the groups that are in conflict with one another. And the more you are in conflict, the more you will be spread out in this particular graph. And so you can see going sort of across the horizontal is Boko Haram on the one side, and on the right-hand side, the security and military forces with which it is in conflict. And you can see sort of going through the vertical are the military forces and security forces on the top, and the violent extremist actors on the bottom. In figure 4, I took out the edges so that you can see where violence emanates with regards to these actors. And so actors marked in red are the ones that exhibit the most violence. Actors marked in orange exhibit some violence, and actors marked in green don't exhibit any violence. And so you can see this shows you that military forces and some of the violent actors are just as violent. Here's where it becomes interesting. If you look at the structure of the violent extremist groups, you can see that Boko Haram is basically in conflict with everyone else, whereas you can see in Libya, you have a dense multiplayer network. And so while you can then have a containment strategy when it comes to Boko Haram, this is going to be much more difficult when it comes to Libya because so many of the militias are connected in different ways. And so it requires a different type of strategy. And you'll see in the next paper, this has an implication for the way people coordinate across borders. So one of the questions that we want to ask then is, do borders matter when people launch attacks? So do they hide out in one country, and then do they launch attacks sort of across the border and pull back? Or do they basically ignore the border and keep on moving through? So there's the mobility scenario and there's the sanctuary scenario. And so one of the nice things that we can do with this data is we can test these types of scenarios. And so you can see here that this is simply to show that, especially if you look at the last 3 years, 2012, 13, 14, you see that things start to change pretty dramatically in terms of the number of events, in terms of cross-border movement, the number of victims, the average distance to borders with regards to these types of events, and the average time between events. So you can see that there's an order of magnitude change, and we can map that order of magnitude change in terms of the structure of those networks. So if you look at the initial picture in the top left, you'll see the structure of the network of violent extremist groups between 2004 and 2009. You can see how they're fairly spread out sort of across the region. And you can see that in 2010, things start to change. The reason things start to change is because Mauritania and Algeria get together, form a joint counterterrorism intelligence cell, and start to push these entities out of their countries. In 2011, you start to see the implication of the of what happens in Libya, and in 2012, you can then see the impact on Mali. The interesting thing about this is, if you look at these social networks, you could have seen the collapse of Mali coming before it actually happened by virtue of the way that the actors changed their trajectories in terms of their actions. You can see then in 2013 that you get the connection back to Libya, and that's because Libya becomes the supply for small arms to Mali, and then you can see the implications of the French intervention by the time you get to 2014 in terms of the way events distribute. And so if you put pressure from the top, from basically the north, and you exert pressure from the west, and you start to exert pressure from the east, Niger, then you can see where groups are likely to go. They're likely to go further south, and so it's not entirely surprising that we start to see attacks, for instance, in places such as Burkina Faso. Now, who do we want to engage with when we're trying to build sort of a coalition of the willing in terms of how we coordinate? And we want to find the countries that have strong capacity and a strong will, Mauritania, for instance, or the countries that have weak capacity but a strong will. And so those are the countries that sort of can require the most help. And so Niger is, for instance, a country that, as a result, because it has a strong will but weak capacity, has become an important partner. And so trying to figure out also, we can figure out who might be, from a customs perspective, the individuals and the countries that we might want to put our greatest effort in, and who are the countries that require less assistance. So now to the second paper, which then sort of asked the question, so can we actually understand how violence diffuses across time and space? You'll all be familiar with policing sort of hotspot analyses. You might even have seen these sort of so we can see sort of gang violence. So it turns out that so criminals tend to be creatures of habit. And so they hang out in the same neighborhood with the same type of people, and they commit the same sort of crimes. Now the problem, of course, is in Northwest Africa, because of these shifting alliances, we can't just draw a hotspot map because people are constantly moving and there's a high degree of mobility. So how do we try to get a bit more of a predictive sense of how this violence diffuses across time and space? And so there's two elements to this. One is the attributes of the target. And these attributes we know fairly well because we can understand sort of how high value a particular target might be. What's much more difficult to understand are the attributes of the actual actors. Oh, you want me to slow down? Sure, okay. I'll try not to make people sweat. I'll try to slow down, sorry. So, if we want to have a predictive model for how groups are likely going to move and how they're going to exploit borders, we need to get to a model that gives us a sense of the calculus that a leader goes through and a group goes through when trying to decide what, when trying to decide where you might launch your next attack. And so there's two things you want to think about. One is the impediments that the distance you need to travel to commit an attack involves. So there's a geographic impediment. There's also a social impediment, because the further you go as a group, the less you might be familiar with the terrain, the less you might know who to bribe, where to get weapons and whatnot. The other are natural features, for instance, such as mountains or so. And the third are borders. And so we need to calculate the cost of borders. And what we do here, think of us basically calculating the cost of borders as sort of virtual mountains. So we're trying to imagine, so if it becomes more difficult to cross a certain border, what implication would that have for the decision that a group or a leader makes with regards to where to attack and how to pick your targets. So we're trying to basically paint a mental map of a leader. And so if you think about sort of impediments would make a particular target seem further away, and opportunities will make it in your mental map targets seem closer. So instead of building a map for each of the groups, what we're doing is we're distorting the information that we have from these violent groups, and we're basically distorting the map. We're wrapping the map underneath the network. So rather than having a network that is generated by place, we're generating place as a result of network. So to understand the proximity of where you might launch your next attack. So we're using spectral embedding techniques, and so we're trying to draw a social network based on the locations where these attacks happen and the relationships between these locations. So you can see when we spread these out, so when we try to look at how closely related are attacks to one another within time and space, that there are certain clusters that emerge. So you can see that Algeria, Tunisia on the one hand, and Nigeria are clusters where the next attack is much more likely to happen simply on straightforward clustering. And so this is sort of all the violence sort of throughout the region if we map it on a conventional hotspot type of mapping. Now we want to integrate the cost of borders and how complicated, what sort of a cost it incurs when you cross different types of borders. And we can map that by assigning a value for essentially a virtual distance that a border incurs. And so if you, for instance, assign a random value of 100 kilometers as the cost of crossing a border, then you can see that the picture starts to pull from east to west. And we would expect that to happen because in West Africa, you have a lot more countries with a lot more borders. So you would expect the picture to pull. And you can see how it pulls even more if we assign, for instance, a virtual cost of 500 kilometers to each border that we need to cross. But of course, crossing borders isn't just a linear function. There's a non-linear cost, and the non-linear cost is the cost of you being detected when you actually cross the border. And the cost of detection will matter depending on what your strategy is as a violent extremist group. If you're Boko Haram and you're primarily focused on Nigeria, then the cost of crossing borders will be different than if you're Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and you basically have a regional strategy and you want to control people and trade routes across a wide swath of land. So we can now calculate these sort of non-linear costs of borders. So what we need to do is we need to take the layer that represents physical distance across the space, and we need to add to that the layer of the probability of crossing a particular border successfully. And so you can see that as a non-linear cost, and the border crossing probability is set, for instance, at 95%, you'll see that the graph sort of pulls and you get this cluster of, on the top, Algeria and Morocco. And you can also see that Tunisia starts to still be integrated with Algeria, but you can see how Libya starts to separate out. So if you increase the probability of being detected crossing a border, it means that you can sever some of the connections and the violence between Libya and Tunisia. At the same time, you see that Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, that they become closer together and more closely integrated. And so you can see the regional strategy of a group like Boko Haram. What's also important here to note is that the center of this sort of mental map becomes quasi-southern Algeria. And this doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of the violence that we see if you look at it from a normal map, because you basically have a couple of towns in southern Algeria and northern Mali that see a lot of violence. But it makes a lot of sense if you look at this from the map of a leader, because those points become the most equidistant points to everywhere else within your region of operation. And so we can actually replicate some of this with actual violence on the ground to see that the hypotheses that we're putting up here are correct. Now we want to overlay that with the habits that the groups exhibit in terms of their patterns of attack. Because of course, in this data set, the patterns of attack are known because we have the events and we have the sequencing of the timing of the events. So now we overlay these events and you basically see three clusters emerging. You see the Algerian cluster emerging, you see sort of the cluster, sort of the Sahara-Sahel that sort of spans from Mauritania through Mali over to Niger, and you see the cluster around Nigeria emerging. So this is now that we're integrating the connectivity of the locations where this violence occurs. So here we have then integrated the target richness, the costs of crossing borders, both the geographic costs as well as the mental costs of the probability of being detected, plus the habits and the experience of this particular group. And so what you see then is this mental map that makes locations seem closer in sort of the Algeria, Libya, Tunisia sort of corridor, and in the Nigeria, Cameroon corridor, and across the southern Sahel. And so you can see the different spatial patterns and the different strategies that Boko Haram versus Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, for instance, explore. And so what you see is more movement, that movement east-west is more likely than movement from north to south. So one of the things then that I think we can infer from this is that the next attacks are not random, but rather that these group leaders are rational actors, or at least partially rational actors, that take into account a whole number of costs in terms of geographic distance, in terms of borders, in terms of the probability of being detected at borders, and in terms of the habits and the networks that these groups have exhibited in their previous patterns of attack. And so what we can capture is then the target richness relative to the habits that these groups have exhibited in the past. And when you put this all together now, you can now pick a particular point of attack. And the question is always, where do you want to deploy your resources? if you want to be effective at containing the group, and where's the group most likely to, in terms of its behavior, going to move next as its radius of attack. And so you can take the most recent attack, and from this now, basically with your circles, figure out what the chances, what the probability is that the group will move within a particular distance of that particular mental map. And so it means you can now deploy your resources, for instance, to military resources to be able to pre-deploy, to hopefully contain the group, but you can also deploy your resources in order, for instance, to increase the mental costs of the reinforcing borders or the probability of being detected at borders, and thereby influence the behavior that a particular group exhibits when it comes to the next type of the next opportunity for that group to attack. So I know there was a lot in these two papers, so if you didn't follow all the methods of what happened here, that's okay. What I'm trying to show you is that with the data that we have, and this is just the open source data. Now, if we could overlay this with sort of some of the data that some of the organizations connect, we can actually start to work towards a predictive model. And the nice thing about this is, this doesn't just work for Northwest Africa. This is a flows model. You can apply this to financial flows, to migratory flows. So anywhere we can have sufficient data where we can start to calculate the costs. And the other interesting thing about this model is it gives you a sense of, if you have limited resources, where geographically do you want to deploy those resources, and on what borders are those resources going to give you the highest sort of return for the investment that you're going to make? And so by anticipating how behavior is going to change relative to the deployment of the resources you have. So thanks for your patience here, and I hope that you found some of this useful in terms of thinking about how we can think more creatively about doing interesting things with the data that we have and start to work towards a more predictive model.
Thank you very much, Christian. I was a little bit conscious and worried about the mental distance between us and the translators because they needed to cope with the frenetic pace. I am optimistic that during the discussion session, Christian will be able to speak a little bit slowly so that customs officers amongst us will be able to break all of this down and apply it to our situation. Thank you very much. As we have political and economic crises, our borders will continue to face challenges. This field of border security will simulate interest from policymakers, from security agencies, of course, from scholars. In the years ahead, we will continue to feast on data, even after 2017, declared as the year of data processing by the WCO. As we learned in the previous panel, it is important that we have agreements on how those data, border security will be collected, how they will be analyzed, and whether we are going to have some kind of standards and consensus in how we get them. The second paper, we focus on biometrics, challenges of getting them, and the possibilities of harmonized standards. Our presenter, another distinguished scholar with many publications in the issues of borders, biometrics, security, and surveillance. He is in great demand as a visiting lecturer and fellow in universities in Canada, US, and Europe. It's my pleasure to invite to the podium Dr. Benjamin Muller, who will be speaking on biometrics challenges and the possibilities of harmonized standards. The floor is yours. A round of applause, please.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I will try to be conscious of a few things. One of those is the difficult job of simultaneous translation. I think my students will probably would believe that understanding me as native speakers can be complicated enough. The other thing that I will also be conscious of is that this is the time slot after lunch. And so the glazed eyes that I know I often have when I'm sitting in the audience can happen. So I'm going to try to be lively and quick while speaking slowly. So we'll see how that all goes. So the first thing, I guess, is to talk about some of the guiding questions here. I'm perfectly conscious of the fact that as someone who works in the fields of international relations and political theory, I'm probably quite far away from someone who works in customs. I think we operate in quite different worlds in a lot of ways. And so I'll do what I can to try and make you see that some of the things I encounter in my world might in fact be relevant to you. And I know in discussions that we've had, much of what you encounter in your world is certainly of interest and relevance to me. The first point is this idea about biometric borders. I want to talk very briefly what actually that is. What are we talking about when we use that term? What are the kinds of impediments? I think there's a kind of dream that existed, perhaps it still exists, about where we ought to be in terms of the use of biometric technologies in border security. And I don't think in any context, even the most advanced border situations, have realized that dream. So how might we move towards that, if in fact that's something that we want to do in national context or certainly in international context? And I think that would relate to the final question is, have we reached some kind of limit, at least in certain circumstances, about that? Something that was said this morning that I quite liked, I think it was Clement who said that there's a dispassionate debate or dialogue about data, and I would have to agree that in many contexts, when we talk about data, there's a kind of lack of politicization and criticality that comes to those discussions. I know in the Canadian context, we suffer from a lack of interoperability within our own national context. And so to try and talk about these things in an international context becomes particularly challenging when we try to put these things into practice. So first, in terms of defining the borders, what are we talking about? Something that comes immediately is this idea that the border is in some sense virtual. That what we're starting to do through the technology of biometrics is to move the border away from the physical territorial border and allow for various forms of pre-clearance and pre-assessment and the kind of risk assessment that we want to do to actually travel with the body, to use kind of the language of biometrics, but to an extent the individuals. And I think that in particular is probably one of the most promising and attractive aspects of biometrics, aside from a variety of other aspects. Because what we do not want is unexpected threats to appear at our borders, but we want to be able to kind of pre-assess these things before we encounter them. There's a variety of forms of sorting that occurs once we put bodies and individuals into digital forms. And some of this is to some extent beyond our control as agencies, as analysts, and it's an important consideration. Within the kind of academic literature, it's referred to as social sorting, the way in which we come to be categorized according to a variety of distinguishing characteristics that our data represents us as. Those things may be legitimate, they may also, in some cases, be misleading. And, you know, some of the cases that we've come across where either terrorist plots have not been thwarted in spite of the fact that we have had data, or instances where we have in fact done punitive things to people who were in fact not guilty, we see where that misfit sometimes occurs. The other point is efficiency. Probably one of the chief selling features of biometrics, and this will work even in those of us who have handheld devices that use biometrics, is a question of efficiency. It's supposed to make things easier. And at the end of the day, if that's not what's happening, then it's perfectly legitimate for us to ask serious questions. Probably the final point there, I'm just going to skip the visa point, is that of privacy. When we're talking about enhancing security through the use of biometrics, it can't simply be that we are doing that at the cost of privacy. And I think that's a really big part of this discussion. It often gets framed within the context of a kind of continuum wherein liberty and security are framed as kind of opposites on a spectrum. Once we do that, I think we're on a dangerous road, and we're failing to recognize that some of the most effective and robust border measures they are effective, they tend to work, they tend to embrace some of these technologies in the best way possible because they strike an important balance between that and the kind of liberties that they enable us to ensure. Now, what are some of the limitations? Part of the reason I pursued this research, I was asked by Interpol to do a report on issues of harmonization. Something, to be perfectly honest, in my other research I didn't give a lot of thought to. There has probably kind of starting around the mid-1980s and then moving to about the mid-2000s, there was a reasonable move towards a variety of harmonized standards at a global level in terms of biometrics. But to an extent, that start to come up against a series of impediments. And that's part of what I want to talk to today. What are some of those impediments, and what can we do as either an agency such as a national customs organization or as broader agencies such as the World Customs Organization, Interpol, the G20, the UN, a whole variety of international organizations that might be able to exert pressure to try and deal with some of these impediments. And there are three of those, and I'll get into these in a minute. Proprietary power is one of those. We have to remember we're dealing with private market actors in the case of biometric technologies. Public skepticism, I think this is really important and gets underplayed in a lot of these discussions. Borders can function well when we have a kind of public buy-in by those who use the border. You're always going to have people smuggling, people trying to thwart what's being done there. But if you have kind of alienated a large number of those who are crossing, those who are trading, and so on, then you're fighting a losing battle, I would argue. And the final point here is in terms of trying to address this, to what extent we have something of an international regime as we do, let's say, in the use of passports. So how do we address this? The first, in the case of proprietary power, and I think this is probably one of the largest challenges. Actors in most contexts, particularly when we're talking about borders, are trying to strike a balance between controlling various forms of mobility and, to an extent, controlling trade, but really limiting that control. To a large extent, we have, as a global community, embraced the free movement of goods and labor and capital within some reasons. That comes into conflict with the kind of free evolution of technologies that biometrics companies themselves tend to produce. I think all customs organizations, border organizations, and particularly ministers and ministries within governments can in many cases be quite vulnerable to the shiny gadgets that are delivered to them by corporations. And I think it's really important that as agencies, we take a critical look as what kind of functions are we expecting from the technology, what do we want this technology to do, rather than simply adhering and using the kinds of technologies that are being sold to us. And that's an important part of this, because the more we can do that in a kind of coalesced manner as an international community and an international regime in terms of managing borders, the more there will be an incentive for there to be some kind of standardization of these technologies. I cite there on the slide an article, and The Economist is quite good at these sorts of articles that aren't very in-depth, but show us a little bit of something interesting, called Taming of the Screw, which talks about some of these issues about technological harmonization by using the case of screws that were used in the making of early American furniture. And that at the time when this first emerged, there was a kind of proprietary power to creating each screw for each particular piece of furniture, which meant, of course, if you bought two different chairs from two different people, the screws were not even interchangeable. And to some extent, we have to ask, is that where we are when it comes to biometrics? And that's a huge impediment in terms of interoperability and interchangeability. The other point is this mythology of industry standards. And I've suggested it's a mythology, others have not. But certainly, there's something for the industry to say, we have standards. We don't need to go down the road where there is going to be any kind of limitation put on us as market actors to adhere to a certain level of standards. We will set our own industry standards. But again, that has not served us well in terms of an international community adopting whatever biometrics we might have. The case of facial recognition in passports is one case in point. Public skepticism. I feel like this is something people are, to an extent, all aware of, but no one ever wants to talk about in these contexts. Not everybody approaches computer terminals in airports or in any kind of context with enthusiasm and delight. Some people actually find this distasteful. Some people look at computers and terminals and start saying a variety of terms that I won't say so I don't cause complications for the translators. And there is sometimes actually very legitimate social, ethical, religious reservations about things like biometrics. If agencies feel that biometric technologies are providing the kind of efficiency, security that they want, this needs to be addressed. Because if it is not, there will be an increasing move from agencies being disparate from the mobile subjects that they are basically charged with managing. And there will not be adequate participation, and that in of itself will cause a lot of slowdown in terms of trying to govern borders in all sorts of ways. So this is really, really important. You know, I've not unironically put a picture of Edward Snowden there. People are aware of what Mr. Snowden has said. I put popular culture. Popular culture does a very poor job of representing biometrics in any kind of positive light. This may seem insignificant, but the biometrics industry itself regularly problematizes this. In its own literature, it's highly conscious of the fact that in films and media, biometrics look nasty. And so if it's something we want to use, that is an area that we really need to engage with. The other part is in terms of efficiency. Are we really getting that efficient dream that we want? The final point is in terms of an international regime. Where is it? I think we can all agree there's a fairly robust passport regime. Whether or not something of a kind of visa regime is emerging beyond a kind of tit-for-tat charging of one or the other state, there are some binational examples. There are certainly a series of best practices, we might say, in terms of various sort of biometric visas. But we do need to ask what the role of various organizations, such as this organization, such as Interpol, such as the G20, the United Nations, in terms of trying to create new norms. And norms are very important in terms of taking us beyond simply a series of best practices, but kind of a normative commitment to how we all basically, in at least an idealistic way, feel we ought to manage our borders, both in terms of trade and the mobile bodies that cross them. So in terms of addressing the kind of limitations, why have we not realized this dream? And I think it's a reasonable time to ask that question. Biometrics really kind of came on the scene in a more robust way after 9/11. I think that is sort of part of the problem in a sense, is that they became associated with a kind of immediate knee-jerk kind of risk assessment, and it allowed for a proliferation within a market that was relatively unregulated, which leads us to the conditions we now have with a kind of lack of standardization. So pursuing global harmonized standards in some way or another is an essential move. We need to demonstrate that the kind of civil use of these technologies can in fact coalesce with some commercial interests, that it is in fact the interests of the producers of biometric technologies to pursue these strategies that move them towards standardization. And that's been done in other cases, so it's not inconceivable. Public consultation and engagement, it's absolutely a necessity in order to have the effective use of these technologies and borders that work. We need buy-in from those who use the borders, not simply by the institutions that govern them. And finally, the kind of shift away from representing this as some kind of trade-off between liberty and security. Absolutely key. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Two different perspectives to one common problem of border security. I think I would want to change things a little bit because we have about 20 minutes to play with. Let me scan the hall and see if there are reactions, observations, questions before we move on. From the left side of the room, any reaction? No, Thomas, I won't call you.
Sorry. If I may, I have a question for Christian. Your presentation is very interesting, very dense.
I'm sorry, is it possible we know you, sir?
Oh, absolutely, yes, sorry. Olivier, François, G Data. I'm presenting on the next session, so you'll see me. I have a question for Christian. So you say at the end that your model can be used for predictions and predict moves or next moves of what the different institutions are going to do or different groups are going to do. Did you try to do that in the past to reproduce, because you say the data is back from the 90s? Is it possible for you to do something in the past, try to predict a next move and see if you predict it correctly?
So, of course, you can't use the same data set to try to build the model and then try to verify the model. So we don't, but if we can work with one of the organizations here, then we could actually try to see if we can replicate precisely these sorts of findings. The one element that I mentioned in there where we can replicate some of the findings is when we start, if you think back to where I started to introduce in the second part of the presentations, borders and the cost of borders. So both the geographic cost of crossing borders and sort of the non-linear cost of probability of interdiction. And you remember how the map starts to stretch from east to west, so it starts to stretch horizontally, and you get that center point in southern Algeria, northern Mali, that becomes the point that becomes sort of equidistant to everywhere else within the region. That we can actually replicate because we know that in these locations, out in the middle of nowhere, we see a disproportionate amount of violence. We're 16 times more likely in those little towns to see high levels of violence than we do in sort of the parts of the region where we see the lowest levels of violence. And so this is statistically highly significant. And it suggests to us that there's something going on here. And what's going on here? Well, that these are highly contested spaces precisely because in terms of the mental map of organizations and leaders, these are the points where it's equidistant to get everywhere else in the region within your area of operation if you have a pan-regional, a pan-African strategy as an AQIM affiliate. But yes, I'm happy to work with folks to see about replicating some of this. Let's say that there are organizations from the West that are helping some of the local actors who are actively using what we are generating here in terms of the way they are training, deploying, and disrupting activities.
Merci.
Thank you. So, my question is on the first presentation. So, Monsieur, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Mr. Fathi Alwi from Tunisian Customs. My question is, although you developed this quite well, the issue of violence in Africa, but I do not know if it was meant to be or not. You mentioned you neglected violence in the east of the African continent, especially violence in Somalia, in Egypt, and if everybody knows the interactions between the various groups, whether in the east or the center or west, west of Africa, I do not know if it was meant or not, if it was deliberate. And the other question is why you did not deal with the political factor and war and its influence on violence. And thank you.
D'excellentes questions.
Very good questions. So first part, why did we neglect the other side of Africa? Because the project was born from a task of trying to concentrate on the 21 countries in the north and west of Africa. And so it's a project on which we've been working on, and the methodology with which we've been working, we've been perfecting it over the past 5 years. It's the efforts made are not negligible. To invest to develop a model that is sufficiently clear or precise to put all this data. So in principle, we could try to replicate this for other areas in the region. But that was not the objective or the goal of this project in the way it was framed or designed. So certainly, one of the efforts we would like to make is to supply or provide more, use the data to supply more evidence, more information or intelligence to the decision makers and politicians and operational and also on the public policies. And I think one of the conclusions to be drawn from this is that we need more cooperation in the region. So the efforts, the efforts that were spoken about, more collaboration between Nigeria and Cameroon, and it's absolutely integral, crucial, because the non-government stakeholders or actors are using the problems between the countries to exploit the vulnerability that the border dictates. And the groups such as Boko Haram that will go hide on the other side of the border, take refuge. If there is no coordination between the intelligence services and efforts to secure and guarantee the border, or at least indicate or report any probability of this. To be discovered, basically, when you cross the border, because the border usually, offer markets of opportunity for these, and these groups will try to take advantage of these types of markets and others. The other is the cooperation between Algeria and Mauritania, which I mentioned, where we can clearly show that as soon as the two countries started coordinating their intelligence efforts and the activities of their armed forces, given that there are two countries with very robust capacity, we definitely immediately saw a reaction in the behavior of the non-state actors who are the reason for the violence in the region. It's certainly the objective to create better decisions, or at least to see where are their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And one of the big gaps in the region is the capacity of the various entities to coordinate, or at least to have contacts amongst themselves. We spoke yesterday during the workshop about more contact between the customs forces in West Africa and in the north of Africa in the MENA region, and more bilateral contact and multilateral contact, which are one of the strengths that we should take advantage of to limit the diffusion or spread of violence and the freedom of the violent actors from actually acting.
Okay, while you wait for the next question, Christian, I'd like Ben to address the issue of privacy. You talked about it as one of the constraints and challenges. I just want to know, just how big do you think the issue of privacy would be when we come to the question of collecting data, particularly biometrics of individuals?
Right, thank you. I think privacy is probably in a lot of national contexts the #1 consideration when we're talking about biometrics. Biometrics can be both presented as, and in fact in real terms, enhance privacy. There are ways in which it can enhance the personal information being more secure. The difficulty, or one of the major difficulties that arises, and I think probably anyone who reads the news is aware of this, that once data enters into a database, it becomes incredibly vulnerable to all sorts of cyber attacks. And storing biometric data, which is incredibly personal and easily transferable, within those databases is where there's a very significant issue. The other point is when we're transferring out of national contexts. It's obviously up to a nation state to make the kinds of decisions it would want to make about the protection of personal data. But the minute that starts to be transferred with other jurisdictions, then that becomes a far more complicated discussion. In the case, for example, of the recent free trade agreement between the European Union and Canada, part of the reason that that's effective, and I'm not a trade expert by any stretch, but part of the reason that that works is because we actually have very similar protections for the privacy of personal information. In other contexts, that may pose really significant problems. So I think, and it's something that very few publics are not concerned about. And so the more that that can be addressed in the rollout of the use of something like biometrics, I think the more effective it will function for the institutions that want to use them.
Still staying with Ben, I'll come to you. I'd like you to see if we can break this to places like Africa, where we're not using biometric borders yet. What potentials do you think this technology has for countries North and West Africa?
Yeah, I suppose I should have expected a question like that. And as my own research tends to be on North America and Europe, it's, you know, whenever I get those questions, I feel a bit out of my depth. I think there's a few things that biometrics has going for it in terms of applying it in contexts such as in Africa and probably specific regions in particular. One of those is a kind of portability that it can provide in terms of border management. It's not necessarily costly in a lot of cases. There's ways in which it can become interoperable with devices people would already have, let's say handheld mobile devices. The kinds of devices that would be used by people working at the border are fairly robust, portable. It can also serve a variety of functions in order to input that data, so it's not simply a border function. It has a broader application in terms of managing populations more effectively. And so I think in any kind of context where there may be not perhaps as much state capacity as we would find in some other contexts, it has the ability to enhance state capacity in that way at a relatively low cost. So I think that's a significant aspect for this context.
Christian, while you take your breath, okay, let's go to the floor. I still have one more question for you. Can I have the microphone, third row? Well, depending on where I'm counting from. The second white row.
Merci.
Thank you. for giving me the floor. My name is Professor Makoundou Dumbe from the Democratic Republic of Congo and an official from Customs. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Muller for his mobilization, but also, in fact, he spoke more about the output, i.e. the result of the violence. So there's apparently this violence for it to reach Africa or these regions. It must be fed from somewhere, and especially when I see the different resources used to be able to reach or to be able to carry out such violence. So my question is, I wanted to know if Professor did not integrate into his modelization the outside of the African system aspects. So there are elements on the international level. Africa does not make weapons. Most of the countries there do not make weapons. The weapons used for the violence come from elsewhere. So did you plan to be able to integrate this dimension in his modelization? Thank you.
Très bonne question.
Very good question. So what we're doing is to introduce into the conversation as a third way to look at violence. So we have the two confidential aspects, which is on one side to study these groups, especially from a qualitative aspect, which is the motivation of these groups, the recruitment of these groups, the funding of these groups, or from the other side, the exogenous factors, as you said, the request or the need for resources in Western countries, the weapon traffic, and all sorts of exogenous factors, outside factors. So then in literature, it concentrates mostly on these two for the factors of violence. And what it does, all it does is to introduce a third perspective into this conversation, which focuses not on exogenous factors and not on the qualitative study of the groups and their attributes or characteristics, but the position and the social network of these violent groups and the way in which this position is going to influence the capacity of this group to spread violence in the region in order to capture potential intervention points, geographic ones, border, and behavior habits. So we're not here ignoring or to say that exogenous factors or qualitative attributes that do not have. In fact, it's more as a complementary aspect of these more traditional behaviors with a perspective of analysis of social resources to give us a tool, an additional tool to try and understand and to better grasp and interpret the violence in order to find new approaches to impose the limits or obstacles to the spread of this violence. So this is more or less the objective of this exercise here.
Guess we need to wind up now, and my mind is going back to the mental map that you tried to depict in your presentation, Christian. And you talked about two perspectives in terms of the impediments represented by distance and opportunities represented by the high impact of the strikes and the violence. If we represent the commander by the DG of Customs of Tunisia or the DG of Customs of Nigeria or Cameroon, what should this be telling them? In terms of, I'm not asking you to predict the next strike, what do you think they should be doing in terms of deployment of human resource, in terms of mobilization of intelligence, for example?
Right, so of course in the social sciences, we can never predict an N of 1. But what we can give you a sense of what the probability is in terms of the area of operations for a particular group for subsequent movement, which then on the one hand allows us to deploy scarce resources more strategically, but also allows us to identify, so here we have empirical evidence of the implication of not coordinating. Because we can show what happens when Tunisia and Algeria do not coordinate on the border, when Cameroon and Nigeria do not coordinate on the border. And so hopefully, by being able to visualize that, countries that traditionally think in very conventional terms about their borders, that their authorities and decision makers will see the negative implications of failing to coordinate and will be more open to the sort of collaboration that will allow us to disrupt the movements and the operations by these groups. Because ultimately, we are not going to fight our way out of this problem. But we can contain, disrupt, and change the incentive structure that these groups use in their decision-making processes. And I think this is sort of what we're ultimately hoping to drive towards. And if you think about this from a larger network perspective, one of the interesting things about this region is that it is among the least networked regions in the world. Politically, economically, security, borders, defense. And that it seems that the more networked regions are, the less violence we see, the more political stability we see, the more sustained economic growth we see. And so that people will realize that working with others can bring a number of positive consequences to our societies. That overcoming the fallacy of composition and harnessing synergies across borders can bring benefits that a country and an organization by itself cannot achieve. And being able to visualize that, I hope, is one way of trying to make that argument.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Christian. And thank you very much, attentive audience. We must draw the curtain to this panel on a very optimistic note, that the more we coordinate with ourselves, the more we collaborate with ourselves, customs to customs, and of course, with the benefits of analysis we're getting from the academia, we'll be able to tackle on the enhance our capacity to understand what is going on in the minds of the criminals, and then what we can put in the minds of our decision makers. Thank you very much. You've been a very wonderful audience. I would like you to end up by giving these two gentlemen a round of applause.
Bonsoir à tous.
Good evening, everybody. After the coffee break, I think that we can now start again with our intellectual activities, for which we are all here present today. First of all, I would like to thank the Tunisian authorities for the warmth of the welcome they've given us and all the provisions that were made for our stay to be as pleasant as possible here. This said, once again, they have shown their legendary hospitality for which they are known throughout the world. And we think that we will be back, while keeping a great memory of this. I would also like to say thank you to the authorities of the World Customs Organization, and especially Mr. Secretary General and his teams for choosing me and my modest person to be the moderator of this panel. Good. Or, as this has been said this morning by the General Moderator, Thomas Quentin, who I have the honor of presiding the panel for, we will be on 3 different paths here. One is about insecurity, which is one of the first themes that spoke about illicit financial transfers or flows, such as misinvoicing. Afterwards, later, everything that was presented regarding biometrics, but before that, the mapping that was done of the activities of criminal movements or move throughout West and North Africa. Earlier, later we shall speak about 2 themes that come within the logic or the rationale of insecurity here, namely a case study on the use of satellite images for the World Bank project in fragile or volatile countries, and then the use of geospatial data, and especially we'll talk about the borders and a specific insurrection case, the one dealing with Boko Haram, a sect which is causing horrible damages in West and Central Africa. To do so, 2 great intellectuals have been chosen. The first one, who will speak to us about satellite imagery for the World Bank projects for volatile countries. The first one is Mr. Olivier François, who is here. Mr. François, Olivier, is a great mind who's in charge of innovation issues, questions, and data science at the GE Data Company. He started his career as an analyst for the World Bank in various development projects. He's also managed price analysis and biofuels throughout the world, and especially within the frame of the World Bank. He is a consultant in various institutions and deals with matters that are related to the environment, agriculture, and generally of development issues. He holds a master's degree in engineering, and he is an alumni of the French Polytechnic School. They also tell us that he holds a degree or diploma in applied economics from the University of Maryland in the U.S. I think we could not have a better choice than by somebody that has such a wide range of knowledge and went through his CV that we've just presented here. I would like, with your permission, to maybe to have the time, if you're not to go back later, to also introduce the second panelist. Why do I wish to do this? Because they will later we're gonna get on board later and buckle our seatbelts, and they are gonna deal about geospatial matters, so things we're not used to. And I would like everybody to be, hold on to their seats so we don't fall after this. So the second panelist is Mr. Thomas Quentin, who has a multiple polyvalent background and bio. He holds a master's degree in philosophy, but at the base, he is originally an engineer, and later he holds many degrees, including a PhD in ethnic science and anthropology. He is a customs agent by profession. He was in cooperation, and he served in Mali, my country, and as a technical advisor to the General Director of Customs. And as has been said, he is currently in charge of the Research Institute of the World Customs Organizations. And we are thankful to him for everything that's been done so far for this conference to be held in under great conditions, good conditions. I would have failed if I hadn't mentioned that he also is a professor or lecturer at the School of Economics of Clermont-Ferrand. As you might have noticed, both are French, and they are of French origin too, of course. They will talk to us this evening about matters related to geospatial or geomatics, to see to what extent these innovative sciences can be useful in the fight against insurrection and security. From a customs point of view, I think I would not have been complete in my work if I hadn't introduced who I am myself. So for your information, I'm Adewale Adeniyi. I am from Cameroon. I am a customs official by career. Currently, I am the regional manager for customs in the center in Yaoundé in Cameroon, and I also work on the fight against the trans-border insecurity with Nigeria. I am part of a committee that deals with this matter in the fight against Boko Haram. I also work in the field of fighting against maritime insecurity, and I work on, and I'm the supervisor for many work at the university in Cameroon this matter. There are some other friends who know me too could have asked. They would say also that I also held a few positions where I was a mayor, amongst other things. This being said, I would like to invite the first panelist, namely our friend Olivier, who will talk to us about the use of satellite imagery for World Bank projects in fragile countries. You might notice that as the subject is very complex and it's going to take us very high, they have used a casuistic so as not to stay into intellectual abstractions. That would be too far out. They are going to talk about practical cases, possibly about Mali or Iraq or other parts of the world that are as many places or centers of interest for us. The second one will also talk about a practical case, as he plans to speak about the case of Boko Haram. This being said, things have been now clearly presented. I would like to invite our friend Olivier here for the first presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like quickly to thank the WCO for having me and thank the Tunisian Customs for their very warm welcome. I also have to thank for this introduction. Let me speak about geospatial technologies and how it can apply to customs and how it can help customs in their work. I will quickly give you who I am and who my company is, because I am not alone. Then, don't worry, it's only one slide. It's just to situate myself. Then I would like to talk about what can GIS already? What is GIS? geographical information systems, and what can it do first in terms of leveraging existing data for customs. I'm going to keep that also very short, and then I'm going to spend most of my time looking at a few projects that we did with the World Bank, at the initiative of the World Bank, using satellite images to provide intelligence in areas that are difficult to access for customs. So we are a small company specialized in geospatial technologies. We are based in France and in the US. We have worked for many years in many countries, mostly on agriculture. And in recent years, we have been contacted by the World Bank to brainstorm and asking us if on specific problems there is something that we could do using satellite images and using geospatial technologies. And so I will present today this part of our experience. So what are geographic information systems? What is geomatics? I'm going to give a very practical definition. Is essentially dealing with geographical data. Most data is geographic to some extent, at least for customs. The work of customs is intrinsically geographic as well. Where the data has been collected and other things can give you information and can allow you to map the data. And if you actually map this data, you may see things that you didn't see before, and you may also see other ways to collect data, additional data that you think could be useful. You can also link that data to other sources of information, land uses, mountains, roads, populations, a lot of things that can allow you to bring things together in a way that are difficult to visualize and to analyze otherwise. It's not necessarily things that are very complicated, but it's things that make it very practical and make the data suddenly much more valuable. I think also it brings in a different perspective on the data. As I was discussing before, I was told this, and it's very true. That the data then, once it is leveraged in a better way and visualized in a better way, it can serve upwards to help the customer make their case in terms of the value that they add, but also downwards to help operationally. And I think the introduction of geographic information systems inside the customs is really linked to people on the ground finding an added value from these systems. So when we talk about geographical information system, it's basically, you can think of it as a sandwich, typical presentation, of different layers of information that you will add to respond to a specific problems, or simply to explore the data. So you would think of having a layer representing borders. On these borders, you can look at what is the land use, in terms of forest, in terms of natural land use, but also in terms of built areas, and I will show some of this. You can think of putting in the terrain, and then you can think of adding some information that the customs collect. And putting all this together will show you that there may be gaps, geographical gaps in your data, that suddenly the data in terms of the value of goods collected is linked to the natural terrain, it links to population, it links to a different amount of things. So to me, one of the first, and at this point, a very important contribution that geographical information system can do to customs is leverage existing data that the custom collects already. Now, let me move on to the first project that we did with the World Bank, which was the finding informal roads at the Algerian-Mali border. This border is quite specific in that it is very desertic and so very flat. So you can pass pretty much anywhere with a good car. And the issue there was that the World Bank wanted to invest in border control and help the border, the customs organization. The question is how? And depending on where, is there a lot of illegal trade or not? And if there is some illegal trade, then there's a need for investment, but this investment, should it be in a control at a specific point, or if the informal roads are really spread out over the entire landscape, then maybe it's not at the border control that there is a need, but rather in giving the custom capacity to actually be more mobile and be able to control a wider strength of, a wider length of border. So what we did for that, we bought satellite images at 50 centimeter resolution along the border, so a strip. And so here you have in black the border. To the south you have Mali, and to the north you have Algeria. And if I zoom in on these images, then suddenly we can see that all the cars that have been passing by left tracks in the sand. The more cars go through a certain road or through a certain area, the deeper the tracks and the more marked. And by looking at this and by digitizing where these tracks are and the depth or the importance of these roads, we're able to map out the major roads and the minor roads relative to where the border control is, relative to the border. We're able to categorize the length of road by area, by category. And although for the World Bank we did it only at one point in time, you could think of doing that a couple of years apart, for example, to see the evolution, if there is an evolution after implementing some new solutions. And so this was very useful in terms of knowing a little bit what is going on at this border, and one, giving evidence that there is a lot of activity, that there is a lot of traffic going on, and the second thing, showing how this traffic is in terms of its geography. The second thing that we did for the World Bank was looking at truck traffic at the North Iraqi border. So there's a very long border in this area. The area is quite unstable. It's very difficult for the World Bank to send people there to actually collect data. It's also a very long border, so it's quite impractical and very expensive. And there is at the same time very little information on how much goods are traded and how much goods go through the border, which poses questions when you're thinking of helping local populations. How much should we do? How much is needed? Things like that. So here is the border that you have. It's at the conjunction of three countries. You have Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And so there, again, just similar to the roads in Mali, we acquired for the World Bank images all along this border, and stretching out a little bit, as you can see in the zoom below. Outside the border is in green there, and you can see that we acquired also 20 kilometers out on all the major paved roads that will allow for truck traffic. And then with these images, we were able to do a couple of things. So the World Bank was interested also in the evolution through time, so there they asked us to acquire 4 different dates. So typically we acquired dates between 2012, 2013 to 2015, depending on the areas. Here I zoomed at the border crossing, and you can see at different dates, but you can very clearly, and we can zoom even more than that, and you can see the trucks really well. And we were able to tell the World Bank, okay, we can count the number of trucks for you. We can even divide them in 4 categories: trucks of 6 meter, 9 meter, 12 meter long, and tanker trucks. So we were also able to do another thing with these images, which is to look at what is going on at the border in terms of infrastructure and in terms of land use. Where are the border areas? Where are the roads? Where are the logistic platforms? Where are the waiting areas in terms of large parking lots? Where are industrial and commercial zone, residential area? And looking at the different dates, when there is a lot of trucks waiting because the border is closed or because there is a problem, for example, where do they go to park? And what is the distribution of these trucks across space? So one of the products that we delivered is this one. So here you have a border in bold red, and you have on the Iraqi side of the border the number of 6 meter trucks at the different dates. And here you can have a vision of the entire border and have an idea of the amount of trucks that go through across time and where are the points where there is major traffic and what type of traffic. Another thing is, as I said, if you take again an area where we mapped out the different land uses, then you can see at the bottom left what is going on in terms of the trucks being parked in these different areas. And that is just for one given date, but you can have also this evolution through time. Now, a third thing that we did for the World Bank, and that was a pilot, was looking at port infrastructure and port transit time. Then, again, the question was limited resources to invest in port improvements, little information and not necessarily reliable information on what is the existing port infrastructure in Africa and Asia especially. And so we did two things. The first thing was, with images, we were able to look at the infrastructure present on each of the different ports. And infrastructure, we are talking about cranes, we're talking about storage types and storage capacity. We're talking about length and number of access roads. We're talking about length of roads to see where are the choking points, where is the missing infrastructure, things like that. In terms of storage capacity, we can count them, get the different sizes, and we were able, as a test, to use also the shadow on the side, for example, to get an idea of the number of containers that are piled up, because the satellite actually doesn't take the picture necessarily straight up, but from an angle. And so you get this shadow, you get a perspective that allows you to do also this kind of creative work. It's very amusing for people who are technical like us to do that stuff. And in terms of port transit time, we propose to do something quite simple, which is at a given date and at different dates, you just count the number of boats that are waiting to unload in at the port. And you can also count them again by length and by size. And that gives you an idea of the number of boats that are waiting, and given the time that the boat takes to unload, given its size, kind of give you an idea of the waiting time for boats. And that could give you also potentially a measurement of the efficiency of the measures that you take. If you take measures to improve infrastructure at the port, to reduce the transit time, then you have a way to potentially assess how efficient your investments were, or at least try to get to it. Now, in terms of other applications, not related to a specific project, but some ideas in terms of what is being used or not and what could be used. There's border infrastructure, so similarly to the port, similarly to what we did at the north of Iraq, but you can extend it to other types of infrastructure at the border. You can also extend it to a time analysis where you're going to check from 1 year to the next or across a couple of years how this infrastructure changes through change analysis. Same thing with land uses. So you can look at the change in land use clear to a border. You can look at what type of natural habitats are there, things like that, what type of, and the last thing are settlements, and this is images that are taken from Malawi. We were supposed to maybe help the government for a census, and there we showed them that in this context, and it's obviously always context related, you can look at the area of roof that exists in different parts, which gives you a way into seeing how many people are there. And you can see across time, again, the development of settlements and how they are laid out, how close to roads, what is the access. You can lay out different points, maybe water points and other things that are interesting. I think that, yeah, that's my thank you slide, but I think there's also, the customs generally operate in a wider context, in a more complex context with local populations that go on about their business. For example, you could have populations that are mobile with cattle raising. The name escapes me in English, but transhumance. And
And for example, there you could look at the evolution of pastures. You can look at how well pastures are doing to predict whether some populations may gather to the same points where they're going to find water, where they're going to find food for their cattle, and predict and be able to analyze a little bit the movement of these populations since it will interfere or not with the customs work.
Vous l'auriez déjà fait.
Which is already done. You already have applauded. You have seen to what horizons he's taken us to. And I think we're going to stay in this space shuttle, so we need to keep our seatbelts on as